What does it take to break a man who once dragged his best friend out of a burning fire base, his own leg torn open by shrapnel, blood soaking through his boot, and still kept going until the helicopter came? A man who for 3 days after that sat by the dying friend's side in a mash tent, holding his hand while he whispered, "Don't let them forget me, Jack." Meet Jack Riley, United States Marine, survivor of Khe Sanh. A man who stared down death so many times it became routine. His hands could fix any engine, his voice could calm any storm, and his word was unbreakable. For 5 decades, Jack lived by a code: duty, order, and the belief that if you served your country with honor, it would honor you in return. He built a life on that belief, a solid one: husband, grandfather, mechanic, mentor. He was the kind of man who never asked for help because he never needed it, the kind of man others leaned on, not the other way around. But no man is unbreakable forever. Jack's next war wouldn't come with bullets or bombs. It would come in manila envelopes and phone-hold music. The enemy this time wasn't a uniform, but a bureaucracy, an invisible, indifferent force with no face and no sense of shame. And this time, Jack wouldn't be fighting for territory or survival. This time, he'd be fighting for something much harder to reclaim: his dignity. This is the story of the war after the war, of how a man forged in battle was nearly undone not by an enemy, but by the very nation he bled for. A battle fought in silence, a betrayal written in ink, and the long, punishing fight to be seen. Stay with us. Jack Riley's watch isn't over. It's just beginning. Jack Riley's garage was his sanctuary. It was a cathedral of order. Every wrench, every socket, every screwdriver hung in its rightful place on the pegboard, a gleaming testament to a life of control and competence. This was where Jack, even in his 70s, could still make sense of the world. He could take a sputtering engine apart and, with patience and skill, make it whole again. He was a creator, a fixer. It was who he was. But a thief had crept into his sanctuary, a silent, patient thief that began its work not by taking things, but by making them fall. It started with a coffee cup, inexplicably slipping from his grasp. Then, a bolt he couldn't quite turn, his fingers feeling like they were wrapped in cotton. He'd shake his hands, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, and blame the morning chill. Carol, his wife of nearly 50 years, would watch from the kitchen window, her heart catching in her throat. But she said nothing. She knew the wall of pride he lived behind. The thief grew bolder. It was a creeping shadow, a numbness that started in his fingertips and was now marching up his arms. The doctors called it peripheral neuropathy, a long clinical name for a simple, brutal truth. The nerves that connected him to the world were dying. A parting gift from the Agent Orange-soaked jungles of Vietnam, delivered 50 years late. Still, Jack refused to surrender. "It's just age, Carol," he'd insist, his voice a little too firm. "Everyone gets old." But his world was shrinking. The garden he once commanded lay fallow. The driver's seat of his beloved Ford F-150 felt foreign at night. The breaking point didn't come with a roar, but with a child's gasp. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon. Jack was in the backyard with his grandson, 8-year-old Leo, trying to teach him the art of casting a fishing line. "It's all in the wrist, champ," Jack said, his voice full of the easy confidence he always projected. He drew the rod back to demonstrate. But as his arm came forward, the shadow took over. His grip, which had once held a rifle steady in a firefight, simply vanished. The rod, weighted with its lure, flew from his hand, tumbling backward through the air. It clattered onto the patio stones, inches from where Leo stood. The boy wasn't hurt, but he leaped back, his eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the fishing rod. It was the fear of seeing his hero, his invincible grandpa, suddenly become fallible. In that instant, Jack saw himself through his grandson's eyes, not as a pillar of strength, but as a danger. The shame was a physical blow, colder and sharper than any winter morning. That night, Carol didn't need to argue. She simply placed a shoebox on the kitchen table between them. It was overflowing with medical bills. "This isn't age, Jack," she said softly, her hand covering his. "And this isn't charity. You earned this. It's time." He looked at the picture on the mantel, a lean, 19-year-old Marine with fearless eyes, ready to take on the world. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, he nodded. "All right, I'll play their game." The next day, he began his new mission. He assembled his intelligence, every medical record, his DD-214, letters from doctors, with the same precision he once used to field strip his rifle. He organized it all into a thick 3-ring binder, each section perfectly tabbed. This was his evidence, the truth. He mailed it to the Department of Veterans Affairs, confident that logic and facts would carry the day. He was a Marine. He had done his part. Now the system would do its part. He believed that. He truly did. 4 months later, the system responded. It came in a thin, standard-issue business envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a request for more information. It wasn't a notice of delay. It was a denial. He read the reason, a line of cold, bureaucratic ink that felt more violent than any weapon. Insufficient evidence to substantiate the condition as service-connected. Insufficient evidence. His doctor's detailed report, his service records, his own life story, all of it dismissed. It wasn't just a rejection, it was an erasure. The United States government, the very institution he fought for, had looked at his pain and declared it an illusion. In his quiet garage, surrounded by the tools that defined him, Jack Riley felt a profound and terrifying thought take root. Maybe the war wasn't over after all. The first denial was a shock assault. Jack's response was pure Marine. Dig in and counterattack. If the system wanted more evidence, he would drown it in evidence. He took a significant chunk of their savings and paid for a nexus letter from a specialist in Boston, a doctor who literally wrote the book on service-connected toxic exposures. The report was 14 pages long, dense with medical citations, and left no room for doubt. It was a cannonball of pure fact aimed at the heart of the bureaucracy. Next, he needed witness statements. Buddy letters. The phrase sounded so friendly, so simple. The reality was a journey into a 50-year-old wound. He sat at his kitchen table for weeks, staring at the phone, his hand trembling for a different reason now. These were numbers he hadn't dialed in decades. These were voices that belonged to ghosts. His first call was to a man named Bill, a corporal from his platoon, now living in Oregon. The small talk was a minefield of awkwardness. They danced around the years, the lost time, the things they'd both rather forget. Finally, Jack got to the point. He needed Bill to write a letter to confirm they had patrolled through the heavily sprayed Ashau Valley. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Geez, Jack," Bill finally said, his voice raspy. "That was a lifetime ago. I don't know if I remember specifics. I try not to." Bill eventually agreed, but the conversation left Jack feeling hollowed out. He wasn't just asking for a favor. He was asking another man to tear open his own scars for the sake of his fight. He made 3 more calls like that, each one costing him a piece of his soul. He packaged the new evidence, the expensive Nexus letter, the hard-won buddy statements, and sent it off. This time, he felt a grim certainty. This was it. There was no room for denial now. He had answered every question, filled every gap. He had built an irrefutable case. 6 months bled into 7. The silence from the VA was a form of torture. Finally, another thin envelope arrived. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs as he tore it open. It was another denial. But this time, the reason was so absurd, so grotesquely bureaucratic, it felt like a punchline to a sick joke. His entire appeal, with its mountain of proof and painful testimony, had been rejected without review, because he had filed it using Supplemental Claim Form 20-0995, revision date June 2021. A new version of the form, revision date August 2022, had been issued while his package was in the mail. His timing was off by 3 weeks. That was it. The dam broke. A roar of pure, helpless rage erupted from Jack's chest, a sound Carol hadn't heard since he first came home from the war. He swept the letter, the bills, everything off the kitchen table. And then he did the unthinkable. He stalked into his office, grabbed the thick binder, his 2 years of work, his hope, his proof, and threw it into the trash can. "It's over, Carol," he yelled, his voice cracking. "They win! Let them win!" He slumped into a chair, a great shuddering wreck of a man. The system hadn't just denied him, it had mocked him. It had made his entire struggle meaningless. For 2 days, Jack was a ghost in his own home. He didn't go into the garage. He barely spoke. He was defeated. On the 3rd day, without a word to Carol, he got in his truck and just drove. He didn't know where he was going, but an hour later he found himself pulling into the parking lot of the county's Veterans Memorial Park. He walked past the polished granite walls, honoring those from later wars, until he reached the one that mattered. A simple black marble slab etched with the names of the local men who never came home from Vietnam. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping at his jacket. He ran his trembling fingers over the cold, carved letters. Donovan, Peterson, Sanchez. Names, not numbers, not case files. They were boys he knew, boys who never had the chance to get old, to have a family, or to fight a war on paper. And in that quiet, hallowed place, a new feeling began to smolder beneath the ash of his despair. It wasn't hope, it was duty. He had survived. He owed it to them, the ones who didn't, to not let his own story be erased by a filing error. His war wasn't for money. It was for his name and for theirs. He went home, pulled the binder from the trash, and placed it gently on the kitchen table. The battle wasn't over. Carol saw the binder back on the table and knew the fight had changed. The fury was gone, replaced by a quiet, harder resolve. But she also knew Jack couldn't win this war alone, not with the weapons he had. He was an infantryman trying to fight a naval battle. That evening, she handed him a small flyer. "Veteran Service Officer," it read. "Local VFW Post 78. Walk-ins welcome." Jack scoffed. "A VSO? Carol, that's just another desk jockey in the same broken system." "This one is different," she urged. "They say he's a Marine." The word hung in the air. Marine. It was a language only they understood. Reluctantly, more to appease her than anything else, Jack agreed. The next day, he walked into the VFW post, his binder held tight against his chest like a shield. The office was small, cluttered, and behind the desk sat a man who couldn't have been more than 30. He had a sharp, military haircut and an intense focus as he typed. He looked up. "Good morning, sir. David Chen. How can I help you?" Jack's skepticism hardened. A kid. What could this kid possibly know about his war, his struggle? He almost turned and walked out, but he had promised Carol. He sat down and, with a heavy sigh, began his story. He expected David to take notes, to nod politely. He did not expect him to stop him halfway through. "Khe Sanh?" David said, his typing ceasing. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Jack's. "My grandfather was Army 1st Cav. He was at Ia Drang." The air in the room shifted. This wasn't a bureaucrat. This was a legacy. For the next hour, David didn't just look at the paperwork. He asked questions. He asked about Jack's unit, about his MOS, about the men he served with. He listened. It was a kind of attention Jack hadn't received through this entire ordeal. Finally, David took the binder. He flipped through the pages with an expert's efficiency, his expression growing grimmer with each denial letter. "They're not fighting your case, Jack," David said, his voice low and tight with a familiar anger. "They're fighting you. This is a war of attrition. They burn you out with delays. They bleed you dry with technicalities. They hope you'll get tired or sick or just give up." He tapped the denial letter based on the outdated form. This is an insult." He paused, then looked Jack square in the eye. "They denied my tinnitus claim twice, said I couldn't prove the IEDs in Afghanistan were loud enough to cause hearing damage. I know the game they play." In that moment, an unbreakable bond was forged, a bridge between two generations of warriors built on a foundation of shared frustration and mutual respect. David laid out a new strategy. "No more supplemental claims," he declared. "We're done playing defense. We're demanding a hearing before a veterans law judge. We're going to make them look you in the eye." He reframed the entire process. This wasn't begging. This was Jack Riley taking the witness stand to testify about what had been done to him. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation. David drilled him, prepared him. But the night before, the old doubts crept back in. "What if they don't believe me, Carol?" Jack whispered in the dark. "What if I get in there and I'm just an old man with a failing body?" The hearing room was cold and sterile, exactly as he'd imagined. The government lawyer was a young woman with a sharp suit and colder eyes. She began her cross-examination, her questions designed to pick apart his memory, to find inconsistencies, to reduce his life to a series of questionable dates on a timeline. Jack felt himself retreating, giving the same short, factual answers that had failed him before. He was losing. David, sitting beside him, saw it. He leaned in close, his voice a fierce whisper in Jack's ear. "Jack, stop answering her questions. Answer the question she's not asking." Jack looked at him, confused. David pressed. "Tell them what it cost you, not what happened, what it cost you." Something clicked. Jack turned his gaze from the lawyer to the judge, an older man who had been watching him silently. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, The voice was different. It was the voice of the man from the memorial wall. "You want to know the exact date I was exposed?" he began, his voice quiet, but carrying across the room. "I can't give you one, but I can tell you the date I dropped my grandson's fishing rod because my hands wouldn't work. I can tell you about the shame of having to ask my wife to button my own shirt." He slowly, deliberately held up his trembling hands for the whole room to see. These hands once fixed engines. They held my children. They held my rifle for this country. He looked directly at the judge. "It took a single tour in a jungle halfway around the world to get this wound. It was delivered in a moment. Why has it taken me 2 years, 2 denials, and a mountain of paper just to prove to my own country that it exists?" The room was utterly silent. The government lawyer sat down, her notepad empty. Jack had said nothing more than the truth, but he had finally said it in a language they could not ignore. 6 weeks later, the envelope came, thick, heavy, different. Jack didn't open it right away. He sat at the kitchen table, the house silent but for the ticking clock. Carol stood behind him, her hands warm on his shoulders. "Whatever it says," she whispered, "we're okay." He nodded. Then, slowly, carefully, he opened it. "The board finds in favor of the veteran a grant of service connection, retroactive to the original date of filing." No cheering, no shouting, just a long breath. His shoulders, for the first time in years, relaxed. A single tear slipped down his cheek. Not for the money, not for the back pay, for the simple truth that finally someone had listened. But Jack knew something then. This wasn't the end. 3 months later, on a Tuesday night, Jack sat in the same chair where he'd once told his story. But this time, across from him, sat a young Marine, fresh back from deployment, fists clenched around a denial letter. "It's like I'm invisible," the young man muttered. "Like none of it ever happened." Jack didn't argue. He just reached into his bag and pulled out a binder, the same one, worn at the corners, full of scars. He placed it gently on the table. "I know," he said softly, "but you're not alone. Not anymore." And as he leaned in to help, voice steady, hands trembling slightly, Jack Riley found what the war could never take from him: purpose. His watch had begun.